Unfortunately, it's very difficult to say a few words about Top. I've known him for about 54 years, which is a long time. I was but in diapers when I first met him, and we were all living in Hong Kong. And I received, before I came here, a list of some of the things that he had done. Well, you know what? I'm not going to read you the whole list, because if you did, we'll be here through breakfast, through lunch, through breakfast, dinner, lunch, and we'll turn into nothing but not people, because Top has one of the most deliciously wonderful lives. And he really started out, he was born, some say, in South Harlem, or North Harlem, or the Bronx, or Queens. And during World War II, he enlisted in the infantry. Very romantic. Maybe that was to get out of that part of the world. And he enlisted, and he was in the Philippines. And from the Philippines, that's when sort of his journalistic life started. He really was a 26-year-old when he first went to China. And it looks as if he loved it. I'm looking for the photographs. Oh, there. They look like an X-ray. Is that correct? What is that, a photograph? We'll see. Anyway, he went to the Missouri School of Journalism and loved that. And then he finally, at some point, met this blonde, Audrey, who was the daughter of... There's Audrey. Stand up, Audrey. Come on, because she's as much part of the Topping group as anyone else. And Audrey was living in China, Canadian, actually. And she loved the idea of living and marrying a very dashing correspondent, I must say. And so, among other things, they not only moved all around the world and reported from all around the world, but they also managed to raise 5 daughters, which was really quite an extraordinary feat, since 4 of them were born in different countries. Anyway, some of the things that Top has been involved with, and afterwards, please don't say, oh, God, you forgot to mention. Yes, I'm sure I forgot to mention something. We all know that he was in charge of the Pulitzer Prizes at Columbia. But he also did a whole bunch of other stuff. My gosh, it's really quite extraordinary. He was, for 33 years, a reporter for the New York Times. Do we have the photographs here?
Yes, they're on the screen.
What?
They're on the screen.
Oh, they are. Oh, from sideways here, it looks like part of your back anatomy. He did just about everything at the New York Times, and he was very good at it, and he was promoted all the time. But he really started in Southeast Asia and was involved with Zhou Enlai finally, and in China and so forth. And actually, Audrey and Top were about the first people who ever drove on the Karakoram Highway, which something that Sheila, Nick, Oz, and I tried to do, despite all the mud, and we had to turn around. But they succeeded in doing it. And he was for 33 years with the Times, but before then he was with just about every other publication you have heard of. And he's really, you know, I think it's October 21st. Is it, Audrey? His birthday? Ah, good. Oh, sorry. December 11th. If we can all keep in mind December 11th, because that's when Top is going to turn 96. And so we are very honored to have him. He said he'd like to come because he wanted to say some words about Oz. So Top, my darling, can you come up here? Here he comes.
I celebrated just for the record, I celebrated my 95th birthday by playing that morning tennis. My congratulations to Ellen Barry for her superb and very courageous reporting on the central issue of our era, the status of women. And thank you so much, Inga, for the tribute to me during this meaningful celebration founded and bearing the name of Osborn Elliott. There are many reasons to celebrate the name of Osborn Elliott because in the telling of it, it reflects a great deal about our own history and our own condition. Oz, in World War II, he fought in the Pacific. That's his first experience in Asia as an ensign aboard a combat cruiser. It was a very lively action. In the development of quality media, he trained hundreds of journalists during his 7 years as Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. Prominently in legacy, Oz is celebrated, and I'm sure, as many of you know, as the prize-winning editor of Newsweek. He transformed the magazine brilliantly and in the process heightened moral and craft standards for American media, the impact of which we still feel today. In coverage of the civil rights movement, his Newsweek put forward an action plan for dealing with the nation's racial problems. It was very much in keeping with Elliott's personal crusade to revitalize New York and other American cities. If Oz was with us today, I am certain that he would be in the forefront of the current struggle in defense of democracy and free, independent media. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Seymour Topping and to Oz Elliott. It's now my great pleasure to bring to the stage Marcus Brauchli, former editor of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, now with North Base Media, and as I've said, chair of the Oz Elliott Prize. Thank you. Chair of the jury.
I felt after that I had to go up the front of the stage. It's wonderful to see so many old friends here again today. I'm especially pleased to see and to join in honoring Seymour Topping, who's so deserving of today's recognition. It doesn't seem so long ago that he and I worked together at the New York Times. He was the managing editor. I was a copy boy. I'm not sure he knew who I was, but I delivered carbon copies of many articles to his inbox. Thank you. I've received praise, finally. He was a distinctive figure in the newsroom in those days with his silver hair and impeccably tailored suits, as you just saw, and a calm demeanor no matter what the crisis. In those days, it seemed like popes and Soviet leaders were dying all the time, and he was always sort of at the forefront of deciding how to play those stories. He was a model for all of us who aspire to be journalists. I later found myself in China in the 1980s and 90s, treading in his footsteps and reading about his time as a fearless American correspondent during the Civil War, when the communists came to Nanjing and to Shanghai and shaped the country that so many of us in this room later reported on. So congratulations again to you and to Audrey. What makes the Osborn Elliott Prize so special is that it honors people who use their genius at journalism to deepen and widen our understanding of a vast and important region. One of the most brilliant journalists at doing that was Michael Elliott, who served many years on the jury for this prize. Although Michael, who hailed from Liverpool, was no relation to Osborn Elliott, they knew and liked each other. Michael worked many years at Newsweek, which Oz Elliott obviously had shaped, as well as at The Economist and at Time, before taking the top job at ONE, Bono's humanitarian organization in Africa. To many people here, Michael was a close friend, a loyal colleague, and a reliable, hilarious, and sharply perceptive raconteur who could spice any conversation with passion and poetry. He died last July, and we miss him still. Today we're here to celebrate another brilliant journalist, Ellen Barry of the New York Times. Every year, the jury of the Osborn Prize receives scores of entries of the Osborn Elliott Prize receives scores of entries from globe-straddling media megaliths, I had to say that, with armies on the ground across Asia, to rising startups in South Asia. This year's crop included an entry from the Center for Investigative Journalism on education fraud in Nepal, a powerful account of the vigilante police units in the Philippines from Reuters, Washington Post's amazing look at the background of North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, and some fine work from The Intercept on the spread of dangerous industrial poisons from the West to China. In this group, Ellen Barry's work stood out this year. Her lyrical writing style, the beautiful way she tells a story, drew the jury's attention. In her reporting on Indian girls who have left their homes in cloistered villages to go work in fast-changing cities, in her accounts of how pollution devastates the lives of people both rich and poor, she brought to life places and people many readers, no doubt, had never seen. The jury was deeply impressed with her work, and so this year we're pleased to award the Osborn Elliott Prize to Ellen Barry. Ellen? She's got her microphone. Sir.
Josette and Henrietta, will you come up to...
We're going to do one more photo.
It's very nice.
That's
Thank you.
kinda-
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do.
Your name should... Where?
Started a thing.
You should be
we
holding
have
this,
to.
not me. 'Cause it's
Okay,
yours.
that's.
I'm just the guy who delivers it.
Maybe we move this way a little.
Okay.
You move here.
I'll just stand in the back. Good.
Right. Thank you.
Over you do, Tom.
So after covering India for 4 years, I have to say it's very satisfying to be here because any encroachment on Chinese territory, it means a lot to us in India. Seriously, to the Elliott family, I'm so grateful for this award. It really means the world to me, in part because this work meant more to me than anything I've done up until now. These are stories, but wrapped in the stories is an idea that I think is a powerful idea, which is that market forces can be marshaled to weaken and to overturn patriarchal social structures that seclude and confine Indian women. That's an idea that I think I'd like to propel as far and as fast as I can. And I think it could change millions of lives if it's taken up seriously. I want to thank my editors, Michael Slackman and Joe Kahn, because this was, as I'm sure you've already recognized, it was a very idiosyncratic project. It didn't look like New York Times reporting. the format was completely different from the way we've done our foreign correspondence for the last 20 generations. And it is incredibly exciting to be part of a moment where we are expanding our perimeter as journalists. We are finding new ways to tell our readers about the world, and I'm really very proud to be a part of that. Anyone who's been in this industry knows that what the reporter files is not the same thing as the reader reads. And in this case, I was incredibly lucky to work with one of the most talented editors I've ever encountered, Christine Kay. Every sentence and every paragraph of this piece was shaped by Christine. And anyway, I wanted to thank her as well. Finally, somewhere on the other side of the planet, my husband is taking care of my children. And well, this is true of all of us. I couldn't do it for a day without him. So.
Thank you, Ellen Barry. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today. We always, those who've been to these events over the past few years know, we try to find somebody. We succeed at finding somebody, a luminary from the world of journalism to do the Q&A. Our moderator today, you have his bio in the program, was for the better part of a decade the editor-in-chief at The Economist, and is today holding that same title at Bloomberg News. So he has had the top editor's job at two of the most influential news organizations in the world. Please welcome John Micklethwait.
Thank you all very much. And I quickly begin by just also paying tribute to the Elliott family, particularly Alec, and to Seymour Topping, who was a legend even in my youth, and actually in my case particularly to Mike Elliott, who when I first came to work here in the Los Angeles office of The Economist was my boss. And if he looked down on me now, the first thing he would say would be something along the lines of, "Dear boy, you know nothing about Asia." But the first, I think at the time he said, "Dear boy, you know nothing about America." So it's a form of progress for me. Looking around the room, also I see an enormous number of people from Bloomberg, June, Dom, and many others. I begin this by saying one thing about this, paying tribute to Ellen, is that in two different ways. Is firstly, at Bloomberg, I've tried to say that whatever happens to the future of journalism, understanding Asia will be of even greater importance than it already is today. And I've said that whoever succeeds me or succeeds my successor will be someone who has spent a large part of their life out in Asia, because that is the future of just about everything that we cover at the moment. The second thing is that whenever I've sat, both at The Economist and Bloomberg, in front of people, and here I'm going to introduce China, perhaps unfairly, whenever you sit in front of the Chinese government censors and you plead for more journalists, part of the argument you use is to say that if you have more journalists in China, they will be able to explain to the world the full texture of China, both good and bad, and thereby correct some of the things about which people feel wrongly about China that they shouldn't say. And I think that is true of journalism throughout Asia. But the main thing is when you sit and read this amazing series of articles, what you do is you get a sense of India, both good and bad, on a scale that is extremely hard to replicate. I said to Ellen earlier that I happened to read her articles for the second time, having just watched Lion, the film. If you watch Lion, the film, this is like watching the first half of Lion, which I would suggest is the better half. And you get the same texture. You get it from the girls who get up early in the morning and shape their eyebrows with razor blades and then walk to work with their angles jingling because of the bells around them. You get it in the sense of the man who jumps out of a rickshaw and starts screaming at the person who's burning stuff by the road and saying that that he is killing his daughter, I think it is, who is suffering from environment. You get it in the terrible kind of queues of people going to go and watch films in villages where girls can only go surrounded by men to protect them, A, from seeing the films, but also protect them from other men. All these things come through. And I suppose my first question is, what was the reason for doing this series? What was the thing which started the reason to do this?
Well, I suppose that the big story about India is an economic story. It will be the largest economy in the world in 2050. I'm sorry, this is not India versus China, but I just want to point out it'll be the largest economy in the world in 2050, and it's hard to sort of let that sink in because I think it's quite important. It is a poor country, and it is a country that is growing very gradually, but the way the growth of that economy. The course it takes and how it changes the society is just of enormous importance. And the first year I was in India, I kept driving around in North India and not seeing any women at all because they weren't outside. And you started to have a very strange feeling that they weren't even there. And then when you began to look at the statistics about the labor force, you saw something very peculiar, which is despite a whole set of conditions that should be, as in other parts of Asia, pulling women into the workforce very quickly, in fact, the opposite was happening. India has the lowest percentage of women working in South Asia. The only place lower than India is the Middle East and North Africa, and it is dropping. It dropped by 10%. 20 million women dropped out of the workforce between 2005 and 2012. So this is a statistic, but it's very peculiar. It shouldn't be happening.
Why do you think that's happened? Just to go right at the beginning.
Yeah. So there's not one answer, but part of it is when people move out of really dire poverty and they can make some choices about how they want to live their lives. One of the choices that they make in India is that they keep their women at home. That's a marker of status.
But why don't the women? One thing which comes through all these stories is a sense of we'll come on to the difficulties they encounter in the towns, but the sheer difficulty of the life back in the village, a place where you get forced to drink the water which other people have washed their hair in.
Feet.
Your mother-in-law,
wash their feet in.
Your mother-in-law makes you do that.
So I'm not sure that's a choice. Actually, when India has gone out and surveyed women, they come back with quite a strong, quite a robust response that women do want to work. But there is not very much work in rural areas. The manufacturing sector in India has never been strong. Gandhian socialism sort of turned away from that vector. And manufacturing is the thing that pulls women into the workforce. That's what happened in China. That's what's happened everywhere in Asia except for India.
But the particular thing within the villages that design, maybe describe to people here what life in the villages is like for the women you're describing.
Well, I will speak about the mother-in-law foot soup, which is a very strange tale inside one of these stories. So, in the joint family, in parts of North India, when you marry in, they give you a new name. They give you a new identity. And in this particular village, they had a whole kind of, exoskeleton of rules you had to abide by in order to join the family. And one of them was that you couldn't use any of the names of your in-laws because that was too disrespectful. And in fact, you couldn't use words that started with the same letters as the names of your in-laws. So it's a very complex sort of system of submission that you have to accept in order to marry into the joint family.
How old typically are the people coming in?
16, 17, 18. But the weirdest part of this is that in order to show, fealty to your in-laws is they would have to wash their mother-in-law's feet in the morning and then drink the water. Which is something that they also do for gods or idols. So, it's a sort of symbolic action. And when I saw them do it, it was quite They didn't actually scrub them, but in any case, this was a ritual that they did in order to show the lower status of the daughter-in-law, and this is the way these systems work in villages. It's a very carefully structured social hierarchy.
And these people come around and they say, "Come and work in the cities." They talk about them being mobilizers.
Right.
Maybe describe those, and then we'll come on to a specific example.
Absolutely. So the Indian government wants this to happen. They know that they have to get their people to work. What India has going for it is just a gigantic demographic dividend. And the whole kind of projection of Indian growth is based on putting those people to work. That means you have to put women to work too. So India pays a huge amount of money into skilling programs, which go out to rural areas and try to train young men and women to go work in factories. Now, when they go into these remote places, like the subjects of my piece, most of the parents say no. And the reason is because the girls are being prepared for a marriage market. And it is perceived that if you go to the city and work out of the kind of out of the zone of influence of the caste of the village, they don't really know what you've been up to, and you're sort of
you're deemed to have sinned.
Yes, exactly. So your value on the marriage market is less.
Maybe you could use the example of Prabhati. I'm going to pronounce the names badly. Prabhati and Shashi. These two sisters. It's almost like part Jane Austen, part Gloria Steinem. They're sitting in this village, and the man comes and persuades them to go to the town to work in a garment shop.
Right.
And to begin with, one of them looks fiercely independent, and the other is just thinking about her boyfriend and the time before she goes back. Maybe describe what happens to them.
So all of these workers were 17-year-old girls, and they were preoccupied by what most 17-year-old girls are preoccupied with, which is boyfriends and their own future. They also knew that within the next 2 years they would be thrust into an arranged marriage. And so a lot of them were opting for factory work as a way to get some leverage over that decision. And they were really scheming and kind of, they were coming up with ways to give themselves a little bit more room. These two sisters who ended up being the main subjects of the piece, they were very different. The older one was extremely dark, and as a result, she thought that it would be very tough to get her married off. It would be an old guy. She was not interested, and she kept telling her parents that she didn't want to marry at all. Her younger sister had a secret boyfriend, and so both of them were going to work with their own.
As I remember, her older sister had ratted her out on. Yeah.
Right. It was really complicated, but in any case, they went to the factory. They went to the factory with the idea that somehow they could pursue their own agendas, which is something that they really couldn't do in the village. And in fact, like if you go to garment factories anywhere in South Asia, they are engines of love marriage. It's really very odd, but it is a place where the tradition breaks down really quickly on the factory floor. And what would happen very frequently is that the factory manager, the HR manager, would have to deal with a very angry father calling from the village saying, like, I entrusted my daughter to your guardianship, and now she's running off with some dude from Bihar. And then this is a factory HR manager, would say, well, I know this guy from Bihar, and he seems like an upstanding young person. Maybe it's okay to marry her off. So, I mean, it was just a very, I think this has been true in all over South Asia, but it's a sort of engine of change.
Just keep going with those two sisters. They arrive, and just describe what happens. They arrive in the factory. One of them looks as if she wants to really escape the village. The other one doesn't. What then happens?
So the older one got a fever, and her sister, the younger sister, called her parents and said, "You got to bring her home." And this was sort of heartbreaking because she thought this was her only escape from a marriage that she just didn't want to be put into. And so the younger sister stayed. The older sister went home, and it turned out that the younger sister basically wanted more freedom to see her boyfriend, who was a secret boyfriend. So it's just interesting. We don't read a lot about Indian women sneaking around and coming up with their own plans, but But they do it. I mean, they're coming up with, they're trying to plan their future as much as anyone else is.
Just go through, how much money are the money they are earning in the factories is miserable by most people's standards, but still more than they can get in the village.
Yes. So these are the worst paying jobs in the world. And Bangladesh, I suppose, is the rock bottom. But by any measurement, these are sort of scandalously terrible jobs. So they were making, I think, 8,000 rupees per month, which works out to, I don't know, $120. But then that was docked for their lodging, so they ended up with 4,000 or 5,000 a month. However, there was just no work at home at all. So the day laborers were making, I think, 150, 200 rupees a day, but there really wasn't a lot of day work. So they actually ended up being the main breadwinners for their families. But this system is very disruptive. It's strange. They're not used to taking money from their daughters, and some of the fathers wouldn't even accept money from their daughters because that's simply not the way Indian families work. And in some cases, when they got their first paycheck, they said, well, we're not daughters anymore, we're sons, because we're capable of sending money home to support the family. That was sort of definitional.
And is it, when you go back to the question I asked at the beginning almost, is why don't more people do this? Is that I know these numbers are tiny, but they're so much better than you can get back in the village. And you say there is this sense of empowerment. Is it because they're scared, or is it because there is I suppose, a sense of morality, albeit one we may not agree with, or what they see as morality, which is taught to them that it's somehow immoral to go and work in this way?
I think it is simply too risky to send your daughter out and perhaps lose her forever, and it's not offset by the financial gain. I mean, I suppose we're just looking at a calculus here, that the money isn't as important as the status. But this is really something that the country has to confront, because there's just the outcomes are going to be very different if they don't turn this around.
Why don't people create more factories which are closer to the villages? I suppose I kept on thinking that as I read.
Yeah, so they're starting to. It's interesting. Rather than traveling, 900 miles to the other end of India, now there are a couple firms who are building textile factories near where these girls came from. And that, I think, is potentially very promising. The Indian government is now trying very hard to get into the textile or garment manufacturing business, which is the main way that women have been employed in that region. But it's late. I mean, India sort of would like to build its manufacturing sector, but it's perhaps already too late for that to happen.
And the jobs in the factories, to go back to them, they're pretty mind-numbing. I mean, you sit there and it's just simply stitching the same label again and again and again.
Yeah, you want
in this case for Marks and Spencer.
I would watch them for many hours, and I wanted to fall off my chair. I mean, it was maddening, but they really liked the money. I mean, I think you could tell that it sunk in very quickly that they wanted things. They wanted cell phones. Actually, that was the main thing that they ended up wanting.
The cell phone is a way of connecting with the boyfriend, not least. A big reason, anyway.
I mean, it was a huge status symbol. It gave them I remember asking one of these young women, "What's the internet?" And she said, "Well, the internet is a way to send pictures." And so it was a way of keeping in touch with relatives, but also building their own relationships. And it turned out to be the number one thing that they spent their money on.
What happened just for the people here? At the end of the story in the Times, it ends with the two daughters. One has gone back, as you say, to the village, and the other one, the one you don't expect to go back, has gone back, and the one you don't expect to stay has stayed in the garment factory. Do you know what's happened to them since?
So they're actually still in Bangalore. To my surprise,
she came back. The one who went back.
Yep. And I think most of the women who were in that training group stayed in Bangalore, which is sort of remarkable. I mean, statistics tell you that for the most part they end up back in the village. They'll end up in an arranged marriage, and then after that they're usually not allowed to. 75% married Indian women have to ask permission to go as far as the market. There's not a lot of freedom of mobility if you're in rural India. So the in-laws usually don't want the daughter-in-law to work.
And do you see kind of social change coming in the wake of this? When you look and you see what's in these sort of microcosm, these stories you tell very beautifully with heart-rendering images throughout, do you get a sense that the society which has dictated these things for women is changing at all or not?
But I think money changes things. Income flows change things, and the globalization of labor is changing things. It's just not in the place that we're used to looking. But what I saw is that, yeah, it ripples quite quickly. As soon as it became clear that, like, your daughter's chastity wasn't completely blown up, then people begin to see that it's actually worth sending more girls out. So I think it changes pretty quickly when money begins to flow through different hands. I think it changes within a generation. I mean, that's why I think it's so important. Because ever since, the time of Gandhi, the Indian leadership has tried to get rid of things like dowry and female feticide, through public information programs. And these things are very intransigent. It's hard to stop them. But they're about money. That's what they're about.
Do you see this part of, I suppose I was thinking, do you see this part of a kind of inevitable arc of progress? If you look back at Victorian Britain, I'm thinking, but it would apply in America as well. You have exactly the same stories of people, sort of Dickensian stories of people leaving the countryside, coming to the towns to work in poor factories or whatever, or sweatshops as people saw it then. But behind it, this was the thing that changed many people's lives.
Absolutely. It happened in Lowell, Massachusetts, and it happened in China in a huge way. It happened in Korea. I mean, the problem with India is India doesn't have very many factories, and it's not going to. So that particular sort of export-oriented manufacturing is a sector that's just it's not likely to grow quickly at this point. So I think it's a challenge to find jobs that are appropriate for women and find them near where they live.
Perhaps tell people about the strike. There's a protest where various women start working, and the way in which the village particularly interacts, because I think that's also instructive of the world they come from.
The village.
It's where some people refuse. Some people are not allowed to go and work.
Okay, yeah. So this was actually. I read a small story in the newspaper about a conflict that had arisen in a village, and the conflict was it was about factories as well. So there was a buffalo meat export packing factory nearby that had drawn a lot of people into the workforce, including the women of this village. And at some point, the men who ran the village basically said, "That's it. We've had enough of it. This is too destabilizing. The women here can't work. We're just going to stop it. It's bad for our reputation. We don't know what they're doing when they're at work." And also, the same people who ran the village were moneylenders, and I think it was sort of interfering with their business. So they said, "That's it. This is the end of the women working." And 7 women in that village said, "Forget it. We're going to keep going to work." And the way you're punished in rural India is social pressure and social exclusion. So they were cast out. They became outcasts, which is much more procedural and ordinary in places like this than I had imagined. They woke up one morning and they couldn't share food or share drink or go into the houses of their neighbors. Which is one thing. They also couldn't marry anyone off, so it means that their families were...
One person's bride is even taken away.
Yeah. From so, I mean, social exclusion is something that still goes on very frequently in towns in India. And so they were punished in this way. And there was a sense of that there was violence below the surface, that this kind of rebellion against the village elders was a dangerous thing to do, and it was never very explicit.
There's a very creepy bit where you describe the fact that villages at night are completely dark. You have no idea what's happening outside. You have no...
Right. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the state is absent. It's so weak as to be non-existent. there is a constitution. It's a very good constitution, but it's so far away that it may as well not exist. I mean, the small group control is very powerful and effective in India. It works very well. So they ended up going to the police, and they went to court for the right to work, and they got fairly far, to the point where an outsider had come in and said, look, it's in the Constitution, you have to let them work. And then everyone went away, and it was, and I went away.
Yes.
And
do you think that's what I was going to come on to. Do you think your presence within any of these stories changed it?
Yes, I mean, it was like, every day it was like some space alien had walked into their.
But do you think you were a helpful space alien or
well, I mean, I was there so much that I became boring. But as the tension built to the incident that you asked about, they pushed me out. They made me leave, and I didn't know what that meant. But what happened is that late at night, when there was no police and there was no lawyer or anything like that, basically the men, a bunch of men from the village, assaulted this group of women. They holed up in a house, and they ended up being mostly okay, but one person was left outside, and he was beaten very, very badly.
The husband of one of them,
yeah.
Yes.
And this was the community reaction. This was the judge and the jury and the trial and the sentence, I suppose.
And typically, how many times did you go back to do this? Because I think particularly in this age of journalism, where people correctly, I think, often identify how so much journalism is very makeshift and quick and rapid. This is repeated reporting, going back and back again to villages.
So, I mean, when they were getting assaulted, she called us by accident because she thought we were the police. But so we found out it was going on while it was going on, and we went back right afterwards.
It's an interesting choice, the police or the New York Times.
Well, so she's illiterate. Yeah. So she actually can't keep track of the numbers. So she would call at random whatever numbers were on her phone, and we were one of them. So we were a protective influence to some extent while we were there, but then at some point they just said the journalists are gone, so we should take care of business.
We briefly talk about one other story, which is on a slightly different theme, which is the air that people breathe. I mentioned the guy at the beginning. You have this evocative picture of, on the one hand, a very, very poor child gasping for air because of the awfulness of the air above India's cities, but also the rich also suffering horrifically. And we know, anyone who's run journalists will tell you it's difficult to send people to India in part because of the air. Do you see any sign of that improving?
Well, so the Indian newspapers, and in fact our newspaper, began to really raise a racket about this issue 2 or 3 years ago, but it was very late in the game. I mean, the conditions had gotten extreme by then. So there's a period of about 4 or 5 weeks in January and February, and a little bit in November as well, where I think the particulate matter is 20 or 30 times what's considered dangerous. And this affects children with compromised lung capacity very directly. And in this story, I wrote about a very poor family and quite a prosperous family, and how they saw that the smoke was getting quite serious, and they waited for their children to get sick. And in both cases, it's really very scary. I mean, the rich in India surround themselves with air filters and nebulizers and so forth, and the poor really have no protection.
I'll ask you a question which you might think is unfair, but given what you said at the beginning seems reasonable, is that you look at all this suffering in India, you look at all the ways in which the government doesn't work, you look at the uselessness of the air, and do you ever at all, when you visit these people imagine how much better their lives would have been in China. It's a reasonable question. China, exactly over the period you've written about, China, the progress in China has been staggering, especially actually for quite a lot of the very poor.
So India, if any of you have worked in India, it's quite a hopeful place. I mean, you run into people who live in slums, and it is surprising how they... I mean, I had come from Russia, actually, where the villages are full of, like, inert people who see absolutely no possibility of things turning out okay. By contrast, India is full of people who see a way up and out, whether or not it really exists. When I arrived, Modi was just coming to power, and his message was an extremely sort of forceful one of finding opportunity to rise out of the farm economy, to find jobs, to move to the cities. And people really believe it. I think they don't understand that the jobs aren't there. And this is going to be a real problem for India looking forward, because there's been an expectation set that it will be possible, if you teach your kid English, it will be possible for him to work inside and not outside, and that somehow your kid's kid will have an office job. And there's no sign that that's going to happen. Even the call center business, which is really has been one of the big engines of the service sector growth, they're laying people off as well. That's also becoming automated, just like factories are becoming automated. So this great Indian model of cheap labor and plentiful cheap labor is less and less accommodated to current conditions.
That's a nice example of the story with the strike, as I put it, or where the people were stopped going, is that one reason why the elders thought they won is because at the end of it, there wasn't many of the jobs the women had disappeared.
Right. I mean, this is a real problem. I mean, you need formal sector jobs that don't come and go, that are predictable. And in fact, in that area, all of the factories have now been shut down because it's a new Hindu right government, which says we don't want to export meat at all. And it was a $5 billion export business. It was the #1 food export, and it's being very severely curtailed for ideological reasons. So,
but do you see Modi as, on the whole, as a force for good or force for bad?
Modi is a very successful communicator. He's very popular. He's a talented politician. But unless he can create jobs, that the promise that he came to power with is totally hollow. The jobs are really the key metric with Modi.
With these poor people. We will open up the questioning to the audience in just a second. But there's ask you a couple of questions at the end about how you reported and what you think you learned from this. You know, from the point of view of putting all this effort in, going backwards and forwards. Do you leave with a sense of optimism about what you discovered, or a lot of the stories, looking out across the audience whilst you've been talking, there have been people sort of gasping as you've described some of the more horrible things that happen to women in India?
I mean, obviously there are a lot of retrograde social forces that are holding women back. But I always found myself surprised, and maybe they seem very recklessly
cheerful, almost.
Cheerful, recklessly.
They sing even as they suffer.
I don't know. It's just maybe it's a moment in the country, or maybe it's just the way people are. They seem to see a way forward, even when maybe they shouldn't. So I find it a pretty optimistic.
And do you think, in general, that writers have covered India fairly?
It's very hard to cover India. India is not one thing. I mean, you sort of have one India that's like Australia, one India that's like Mexico, and one India that's like sub-Saharan Africa. And they're completely disconnected from each other. They don't even really know about the existence of each other. So what's covering India? Power, it's a weak state. Power is completely dispersed. You don't even know what, I mean, in Russia, you always knew what to look at. Yes. Everything was inside a box. You looked at the box. But in India, there's no box. It's completely dispersed. So,
well, this wonderful series has done a huge amount to change that. Shall I open it up to questions? And I will now, I think people should stand up. And there is microphones there, and if you could merely identify yourself when you ask the question. There's Josette here.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Is this on? Wonderful interview. I think I'll just shout. Hello, hello. So there's a big debate in aid. We have the former head of USAID here, and I've worked in the UN on aid, as to whether or not all the funding that goes in programs to convince the world to think about women and girls differently versus setting up incentives that would create new incentives for girls being empowered. And so, for example, the World Food Program, instead of we would give the food to girls, and they'd have to get a literacy lesson to pick up the food, and that seemed so much more powerful than all sorts of programs to campaign to change the minds of men, because the change was happening. So I'm interested in your findings, because you mentioned that the power of money and salaries to change old structures that seem like they won't give unless that happens. Could you talk a little bit more about that and all the programs of money going into making the lives of girls better, whether we need to think about it more differently given your findings in your report?
So that's a really interesting question. In India, a lot of the programs that work best are based on incentives, on payments. So, for example, there's a mass sterilization program which talks women into getting tubectomies. And it is, I think, by any measure, successful. They have a huge number of sterilizations happen each year. And what happens is they appoint people within the community who are paid a certain amount for every successful recruit. And this is also the way they were recruiting factory workers. So the government will pay people. It's like a pyramid scheme, in a way. The government pays people to get other people onto government programs. A lot of Indian programs work that way. The problem is once the incentive ends, the program ends. I know that with the employment scheme, when there was a certain day when they got the final payment, and after that there was like a huge drop-off in participation. But it is certainly the case that those things work very well, at least in the early stages.
Do you think those, in places like Brazil, people have tried to do those and do them permanently? You have the Bolsa Familia, where you get rewarded for, you take your child to school, you get paid money effectively to do that. Is that one of the answers? Picking up slightly from what Josette said, does it work better in those sort of micro bribery almost for good behaviour?
Well, it works better. The question is, how long does it work better? And I think it's certainly true when you're doing work in India that working through the local government is the most effective way, rather than trying to impose something from outside.
That's another question here.
Thank you, Ellen. Just to build on Josette's question, monetary incentives last only as long as the money is flowing. But have there been other methods of trying to influence the thinking of the men? So has India tried to have thought leaders or men who are widely respected speak up and argue in favor of change rather than trying to go through monetary incentives?
No, and I think it would make a tremendous difference if that happened. You know, whenever there have been high-profile rapes or attacks on women, it is traditional for some MP to come up and say, well, she had no business being outside at 9 o'clock at night anyway. And female MPs will say the same thing. That is just the orientation of public life, to try and protect women by keeping them inside. And there has been very little effort gone into communicating the need for access to public spaces, access to the economy. I think it would make a big difference.
To what extent do you think Modi is useful or not in that process? You have one of the most traditional, you have someone who economically at least pretends to be a radical, but certainly in terms, maybe rephrase that, has some radical elements, but in terms of his social policy, he is a very conservative figure, or would seem to be.
So the right wing, which is increasingly ascendant in the politics in India, has not been particularly forward-leaning on employing women, but they are but Modi's platform was always about creating jobs and getting people into work. So in that sense, it's been okay. I think the government is beginning to pick up this message in part because the IMF keeps coming in and various economists keep coming in and saying you're not going to grow your economy properly unless you include the other half of the population. But no, there's been no effort to send out that message that Lulu was noting, which is that you should be proud of having a daughter-in-law that works, or you should be proud of having a daughter that works. That has never happened.
You think Modi himself could make that pitch? I mean, here is this figure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, they have taken on issues like female infanticide or female feticide, which are issues that come up, in every consecutive Indian government. They're just intransigent. The number of female fetuses that are killed in before they're born continues to be as bad as it ever was, despite, leadership after leadership trying to come up with some solution. I mean, what I think is that this is largely about money. A daughter is born and she's a debit. A son is born and he's a credit, because it is understood that the son will then support you in his old age, whereas you have to pay an enormous dowry for your daughter. This is just the reality. It's illegal. It's been illegal since the 1970s. But that is the reality for most people in rural India.
Judy. Oh, sorry, Lisa. And then we'll come there later.
Hi. I wanted to ask, you mentioned female infanticide. In China, obviously, there's a big sex gap between an increasing number of boys versus girls. And I was wondering what's happening, how that plays into women's status as there's an increasing number of boys relative to girls because of that selective killing of fetuses or infants.
You mean that there would be a shortage of women?
Yeah, if that was at all playing into any of these issues, or how that has changed the...
I mean, they're all bound up together. One huge problem with infant mortality is that pregnant women are fed last. Why are they fed last? Because they're the lowest status person in the family. I mean, it sort of beggars belief because, of course, you're compromising the next generation. But this is the way it's been structured in at least that part of India that where I was reporting. So I think if they viewed women as potential wage earners, as members of the family who would be adding into the family wealth, they would feed them and they would educate them. I mean, the first thing that happens when women start earning in places like this is they spend the money on protein. They spend it on food. And, it continues to shock me to go somewhere 2 hours from Delhi and find kids who look like they grew up in a famine because they eat nothing but bread and salt. They don't get any protein. They don't get any vegetables. And with these terrible jobs that these women were taking, they spent everything. That was the first thing they did. They started adding things to their children's diet. So, I think these things are all tied up together. And I think if they sort of were addressed as a crisis that they legitimately are, things could change quite quickly. I mean, if you look at Bangladesh, which is right next to India, it has double or possibly even triple the number of women working. And that is because in the 1970s, a lot of the garment trade went to Bangladesh. And so they just put a huge part of the rural population to work. And that has been catastrophic in some cases because of the conditions of the workers, but it has also completely reshaped the society. So these are two countries that were the same country that now have totally different pictures.
Nice example. The gentleman there.
Hi, John Bussey with the Wall Street Journal. Congratulations on your excellent reporting. I'm wondering, the young men and women that ended up in the factories, it was liberating for them to have this new experience. But did you find that as odious as some of the aspects of life in the village were, that they missed the coherence of that social life, given that it was the only coherence that they experienced in their life?
Definitely. I think unlike China, the factory workers in India tend to go for a season, earn a certain amount, and then go back for a certain period. So there was never that one-way migration that I think we've seen in other kind of industrializing countries, because they always assumed that their marriage would be set up back in the village. There was a sense that there was never a sense that they were leaving. And that may be the biggest difference between these two countries, where a huge number of people became city people in China, and I feel like that's just not happening in the same way in India, because people are so rooted. They're so rooted in the caste, they're so rooted in their family, and they assume that when they go out to work, they're going to end up back there. So even when they get jobs with full benefits, formal sector, health insurance, they often leave after 8 months to go home.
How important is caste? Would seem to be the obvious difference between India and China in that respect. But is that the main reason why, or does that play a big reason in the reason why people stay in the villages?
Absolutely. I mean, if it's considered a disaster for your family if you marry someone you met in the city, which is the way a lot of people think about it, how do you move your population from the village to the city? It's almost impossible to do that. So all of these factory love affairs, and they were happening all the time, they were terribly, terribly disruptive. So caste keeps people from changing. I mean, caste also doesn't work in factories. You sort of can't, there's no way to keep caste in factory. You can't have a factory if you pay any attention to caste. So that was also sort of interesting to see. All of these women I was covering came from societies where if you were menstruating, you couldn't associate even with your own family. Like they would put you in a shack outside your home. And so they, without really very much intermediary preparation, they suddenly were working in a factory and they were told, oh, it doesn't matter. There's no difference between someone menstruating and non-menstruating. Yeah. And it was interesting after they ran into this dissonance, they went home and they had to sort out whether they would allow their menstruating roommates to cook for them, because it was considered within the caste to be a cardinal sin. And I remember listening to them sort of hash this out, and it took them 2 hours to come to some agreement. And ultimately, because the only woman who knew how to cook was also menstruating, they waived the whole thing. And it happened in the first week. So all of these things, I mean, you just realize that cities are engines of change, and factories are also engines of change.
You see the Gloria Steinem element I foreshadowed. Lady here.
Again, congratulations, Ellen. Vishaka Desai, President Emerita, Age Society. Couple of questions, but related to one big thing, which is what you said before, that India is pretty diverse, both in terms of whether it's Australia, Mexico, and Sub-Sahara, which is a class orientation and economic orientation. But there's also regional variation. And you've traveled everywhere. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about whether you find differences in different parts of the country when there is greater industrialization in smaller towns. Because that's something that I find there's a big difference. So I wonder what you think about that.
No,
and the other piece is informal sector. Because people like Ilaben, who has done a lot of work on Seva, and other informal sector where women work, there are changes that seem to happen differently. And you obviously haven't looked at that particular piece in terms of your story, but I wonder what your observation is in terms of women in the informal sector. We often don't even get counted, which is one of the problems with labor counting. So how you think about the informal sector, where women have worked, whether it's in Orissa or in Gujarat or in other places, and the diversity in terms of where the changes are, so that one gets a little bit more of a nuance. And because I think one of the problems I find in getting the stories out of India is that very quickly people generalize. And that's a danger when specific stories actually stand for a whole country?
Well, I think it's up for debate whether India is even a country.
India was a country only in 1947.
Right. I mean, the differences between South India and North India are so extraordinary that trying to make any statement is perilous. Trying to make any general statement about India. So with this particular phenomenon, female employment in South India is a completely different picture than it is in North India. I live in North India. Right. East India also has sort of low employment, and South and West India are different. So that is absolutely right. I think most of the manufacturing that I've written about is concentrated in the South, in Tamil Nadu. Also, they have governments that have been very open to manufacturing down there. And as far as the informal sector, those jobs are counted. Actually, in the statistics that I use, those jobs have been counted. And it's absolutely true. Well, 70% of the economy in India is informal, right? So formal sector jobs are very scarce in any case. And sort of the reality is, if you're looking for work, that's where it's going to be, in the informal sector. So I think you're making an important point.
So two people, a lady and then a gentleman there.
Ellen, how much political awareness is there at the village level?
I think it depends on the village. People are extraordinarily engaged with the political process, in part because you have candidates coming in one after the other offering SOPs, offering incentives, which can be like free radios, free laptops, or they can say, we'll bring you 2 new hand pumps if you vote for me, and the village elder will do some negotiation with each consecutive candidate who comes in, and they'll basically promise their vote to every single person. And it's very transactional. The idea, I think, on the village level is often like, what are we going to get out of each of these political forces? It's not about ideology. Modi is huge. I mean, he is still very popular. And he's one of the people who has sort of broken through.
You have the example of the Pakistani, I think it's a local Pakistani elected official who's almost like an old-style sort of Tammany Hall politician who he only gets involved when an election's coming close.
Right.
And also, and his method of dealing is entirely transactional.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's sort of a classic. A lot of people say they got it from the British Raj because when you're trying to run India, you find some little dispute in a village and you put yourself right in the middle of it, and then you solve it, and then you tell everyone, look, I solved it, and everyone does that, and that's what they did in my scenario in that village I was talking about.
Jeff, another question there.
Hello, Ron Tiersky from Amherst College. Congratulations on the prize. My question is not about India, it's about journalism. I'm a professor. Anytime anything moves anywhere in the world, a week later there's a graduate student writing a PhD dissertation on it. I wonder to what extent what you do is typically American. To what extent do you feel yourself part of let's call it a community of journalists around the world? Do you find Polish colleagues, doing this kind of work in certain countries, or is this a particularly American kind of journalism, or journalism that reflects work that goes on in rather a few countries?
I mean, I've been a foreign correspondent for 9 years, and during that period, I was in Russia before I was in India, and you certainly see how the economics of our industry are reducing the number of foreign correspondents that are out there. In Russia, that was even more noticeable, maybe because of the time period where I was. India has been thinly staffed. We all do the same stories. I mean, we largely do the same stories to my German colleagues, my Swiss colleagues. Do we do them in the same way? I think in India, to a large extent, we do. I mean, it's not it's not a conflict story, and it's not a particularly geopolitically saturated story. So I think we do the same kind of reporting, typically.
Get the impression that more money is going in at all into better local reporting by the Indian papers.
Indian papers are really very successful, partly because they're so cheap. Everyone in Delhi reads 7 of them. And the advertising base continues to be really quite strong. So the newspaper is going strong in India. In fact, I was, a few days before I left, I was watching a security guard ride his bicycle to work in my neighborhood, and he was going curiously slow, and I realized that he was reading newspapers as he rode his bicycle to his station. No, I mean, people love newspapers, and they still read many of them, even in villages, I think.
But do they take the same kind of, I suppose, social realism, for lack of a better word, of what you've done, that kind of reporting? Do you see much of that in India?
No, and I think there is a real problem with access journalism in India, and I also think there's a failure to stay with the long-term issues like environmental damage or the economic. These underlying issues are something that the Indian press really doesn't commit to. There's always a scandal blowing up every day. It's always extremely inside baseball, and it's almost always gone in 3 or 4 days. So there's always something to dispute about in India, but often these are kind of issues that come and go.
Stephen Schlesinger from the Century Foundation. How much impact does the outside influences have on the women's situation in India? Movies, television, Bollywood, and influencing and upsetting the social traditions of their villages?
That's a good question. I mean, television has enormous penetration, in part because it doesn't matter if you can read or not. And in the villages where I was reporting, often there wasn't, there was very patchy electricity, and I remember often the electricity would turn on and everyone would run to gather around the TV for the amount of time that it would be functioning, and then they would disperse again when it went off. TV is powerful. Let's see, is it shaping society? You notice that I think that there is an attempt to do that. So there's a show about daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law, for example, that clearly is sort of trying to illuminate these power relationships within the family. But Bollywood, I think that more kind of entrenches the norms rather than challenges them.
Moss.
So we're about 6 months on from the demonetization. Given the role that money coursing through these villages has had in what you're describing, what impact has that had?
So I think demonetization had a very significant negative impact that has been very hard to pick up because the data of the black economy is not capable of picking it up. I mean, I think most of this was in the informal economy. I think a lot of small firms closed. I think many people lost their jobs, and I don't think there's very much evidence that it has brought significant black money back into the system. That said, it has turned into a political victory for Modi, so that's a puzzle. Basically, the message went out about demonetization that this was a collective suffering that would elevate us all in the end because it would make the corrupt fat cats suffer. And that is really was quite a successful message. People believed it even though they were suffering, and they knew that they were suffering.
Lady in the yellow.
Joyce Slayton Mitchell. I work mainly in China, but I have a book in India to do with education. And when you said everything comes down to money, I wonder, you haven't mentioned education yet, I wonder how education fits into that formula.
So the education rate for Indian women has been going up really quickly, and that's one of the reasons it's peculiar that that there are fewer women working. But that is a good news story, there's no question. I don't have the exact numbers, but age 15 to 25, I would say that it's been quite a steep rise over the past 10 years. I think the problem is that in many cases, women are getting educated in preparation for the marriage market rather than for the workforce. This, is mostly true in rural India rather than in the cities. But there's no question that's part of the good news story.
So even where you were working, where in those rural areas, there's opportunity for education for young women?
Often they were at the mercy of their parents who would decide how far they would be educated, but sure, it is, Indian parents, even in rural areas, are extremely fixed on the idea of educating their kids, and it's mostly because they want their kids to get out of the farm economy. Unfortunately, the public school system is very weak. You have a lot of teachers who don't even show up, and there are many, many private schools that are beginning to crop up, which are, in many cases, sort of scam schools. It's like an inch deep. But it is a good way of making money because these are communities where people are really desperate to get their kids educated out of the hope that they will somehow vault into an office job. But this, I think there's a huge amount of fraud going on with people who are paying for private education and not necessarily getting any qualifications out of it.
And for one more question, we'll take the lady there. I'm sorry if there's anyone at the back. Okay, and we do two very quick questions, then we'll stop. There's the lady there, and then the one at the back. I'm sorry I didn't see you earlier.
Mine is related to the previous one. You mentioned, or it was discussed in one of your pieces about the woman, who was illiterate using the phone, and I was just wondering how much the sort of literacy rate amongst women in particular has been changing, and whether the increased exposure to sort of technology, which obviously does actually require the use of it, whether that's sort of helping it, or whether you see that being a barrier to them becoming more engaged in the economy, and whether them going to school is, improving enough to sort of access that kind of thing.
So women's literacy is way, way below men's literacy all over rural India, and tied to that, the access to mobile phones and the internet, there's a huge gap, I think more than any other country that's being measured. I think it's a 26% gap between men's use and women's use of the internet. So that's something that there are a number of really interesting programs that are trying to change that. There's a good deal of incentive because it's a huge market, and the telecoms in India are competing for this market. I think there's maybe 600 million illiterate Indians who could be signed up if they could manage to tap into that market. So that is a real issue. Look, if people can use their phones to get an education, particularly a vocational education in rural India, that could be a completely game-changing factor. But I just wrote a story about the internet arriving in some of these villages, and it was just noticeable that it was the young men who were using it. Older people weren't using it, and women didn't get even close enough to try it. These things happen quickly, though, because people are very keen on accessing it. So it may look different in 5 years.
So, lady at the very end, there's a sign also telling me I have 1 minute, so you have to ask.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is my Monica Shai. I was the Foreign Service Officer in Bangladesh, where I met Ellen, and I'm so grateful that she also covered Bangladesh, so you can read articles about Bangladesh too. My question is, what was the unique challenge for you doing these stories out of India that might have been different from other places that you've covered? And then finally, what's next? Do you have another series planned, or are you going to be looking into doing something similar in the future? Thanks.
The unique challenge of covering India. Well, I suppose partly because it's hard to find the state. It's hard to find the officials who should be answering your question. In a lot of these places, the connection between the system and the people who should be receiving services it's very difficult to even locate it. There seems to be just an absent state. So that was something that I found often tough. And my next assignment, I'm going to be covering Western Europe from London. Yeah.
Going to another dangerous place. I think to end very quickly, once again, to thank the Elliott family, thank Alec, thank many of the people, Tom, and all the people who run the Asia Society. All I would say is sitting here, interviewing Ellen, trying to ask the questions you might ask. One frustration has been that the main thing you can do when you sit here is to try and get her to give some idea of the beauty and the majesty of the stories they work. And I know that's partly due to editors like Joe, and all kudos to the New York Times. But I thought I would end by just reading one tiny bit from one piece, which will give you an idea of what the pieces are like. And I would urge you to go and read them. And it's about the young women who have gone to Bangalore and their first nights in Bangalore. Climbing onto the roof, they can see the sun rising over a landscape of other roofs, where in all directions migrants seek a breath of quiet. There they can gaze up at the 22nd story of an apartment building, where residents come out to hang their laundry on balconies. It is the most amazing thing they have ever seen. Big people looking tiny. I think what is fantastic about this is it makes tiny people look big. Thank you very much.